I thought the series was going to be cancelled, but it's actually going to be the next big anime. About a year or so, I saw everyone hyping up this new manga, Gachiakuta, and while I thought it was pretty good, I actually noticed a few things that made me believe it would eventually get cut. This was met with tons of people saying that I was being too hasty, and funny enough, the manga is still around and 80 chapters later is already getting an anime from Studio Bones. And having just caught up, I'm finally convinced that Gachiakuta will be the next big thing. Now, that's awfully convenient of me to say after it just got an anime announcement, but in all honesty, there's a couple of things I got wrong before, and there's also a few things that have changed since I posted my original video. Now, the first thing I'd like to address is the fact that Gachiakuta is not in Shonen Jump. In my original video, one of my claims was that Gachiakuta was going to get cut because it was taking too long to flesh out its story. It doesn't present its power system right away, and besides the main character Rudo, you don't get any backstories for any of the side characters in the first 20 or 30 chapters. These were also problems in manga like Red Hood and Phantom Seer, both of which were claimed to be the next big thing, only to be cut from Shonen Jump after a few volumes. Now, in that video, I did point out that Gachiakuta was in Weekly Shonen magazine, so it might not be under such strict competition as the newer manga in Jump. But this didn't stop people from discussing the different environments for these two magazines. And for good reason. Shonen Jump is a bit more aggressive when it comes to making cuts, and part of this is because it already has massively popular series like One Piece and Jujutsu Kaisen. So if you're not making the cut by chapter 20, then they want to move on to bigger, better things. Especially if you're a battle series. Weekly Shonen magazine, however, is not in the same position. While it does have its clear breadwinners, it doesn't have these same echelons. All of the manga in the magazine are more or less within the same threshold, and a lot of these manga have slow starts as well. As a matter of fact, Fire Force, one of its most popular series, was one of those manga that started off really slow in almost the exact same way Gachiakuta does. So, to anyone who's like, I don't know, I really only like Jump, I don't care about other magazines, just know that this is the same magazine that has put out other major series like Ashita no Joe, Hajime no Ippo, Vinland Saga, Fairy Tail, and of course Fire Force. And speaking of Fire Force, there's something else I neglected in my original video. So before I mentioned that Gachiakuta's creator, Kei Urana, is not a proven veteran. At least she wasn't before. And while that wasn't a definitive obstacle, it was one of several factors running against her. Now, what I didn't realize was just how important her work on Fire Force was. As an assistant on Fire Force, Urana was naturally exposed to Okubo's unique approach to manga and his distinct art style. And in many ways, you can see how Urana has borrowed from the art style of Fire Force. Plus, Fire Force was a major title while it was running in Shonen magazine, so it's only natural that they would give Urana the benefit of the doubt, which is why when Gachiakuta debuted, it was marketed as the spiritual successor of Fire Force. So sure, Urana might not have a bunch of big manga like say Hiro Mashima, but she does have all the right experience. And speaking of Mashima, it's worth noting that he wasn't a proven veteran either. He didn't even go to art school, and he still managed to get to where he is today. So while something like this is worth considering, it's clearly never going to be a deciding factor in a mangaka's success. Now, at this point, we've covered what I got wrong in my other video. We talked about the kind of magazine Gachiakuta is in, and we've talked about what makes Urana stand out from most new mangaka. But at this point, you're probably wondering, okay, so obviously it's worth checking out, but is it really going to be the next big thing, or is this more so everyone hyping it up because they want it to blow up? Well, as someone who used to think this manga was overhyped, let me explain what's changed over the last 80 chapters, and how Gachiakuta has come to set itself apart from just about every other ongoing manga. Actually, before I do that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, one of my biggest complaints when reading Gachiakuta for the first time was that we didn't get any backstories for anyone besides Rudo. First, you meet Engine, and he's pretty cool, but he's also a mysterious character. Ryo is a badass character that can cut people down with giant scissors, but that's kind of it. The closest thing we get is some characterization for Zanka, a character who claims he isn't a talented genius like some of the other characters, and struggles to live up to his self-imposed expectations. But still, no backstory. No look at why he has this motivation. This was the state of Gachiakuta, not 10, not 20, 30 chapters into the manga. Clearly, it takes its time fleshing its characters out, but it's not long after that we do finally get some satisfying answers to these characters. And I'm not going to get too deep into them because I want you to be able to read the manga spoiler-free, but it's worth noting that we learn why Ryu is such a badass character and why she's somewhat secretive. We do get a full backstory for Zanka and why he is the way he is that just so happens to flesh out the story's world building. And in that same backstory, we also get some additional characterization for Engine. So while it does take a hot minute to get to this point, it's well worth the time to invest in these characters. And judging by the current story, it's only going to get better. Now, that was the big thing for me. While I did have more than a few complaints, characters were the only really big one for me. So thankfully, I can say that Gachiakuta is a manga with plenty of unique and memorable characters. But there's something else that I never even mentioned in my other video that's completely changed why I want to keep up with this manga. So before, Gachiakuta was just another manga. It was cool, but I had no problem putting it on my ever-growing backlog of manga to binge at my convenience. That was the case for about a year or so. But a few months ago, I read Soul Eater for the very first time. It was my first time experiencing that series because I had never even seen the anime. And it quickly became one of my all-time favorite manga. As soon as I finished Soul Eater, I went right to Fire Force and binged that from beginning to end. And I was blown away by that story, its characters, and everything Okubo did to thank his old school fans and create something entirely brand new all at the same time. Since then, I've come to cherish Okubo's unique art style, as I've still never come across anything quite like it. And I also became a huge fan of how he layers in mature themes and topics without dumbing them down or preaching at readers. Fast forward a few months later, and now I'm picking up Gachiakuta again. And now I'm looking at it in a completely different light. Before, when people said it was the spiritual successor of Fire Force, I was like, okay, cool. But now, after catching up, after reading all of Okubo's manga, I'm blown away by how much this manga borrows from those series, but also the ways in which it improves on them. So for example, I mentioned before how Fire Force is another story that is kind of a slow burn. In the case of Fire Force, it kind of dedicates the early chapters to the world building, taking its time before it really gets into the plot. In many ways, Gachiakuta does the same thing. The first 20 chapters or so are mainly concerned with building the world of Gachiakuta, but oddly enough it actually does even better than Fire Force. So in Fire Force it kind of drops everything all at once. Because of this, the plot kind of suffers. So you learn a lot about the world in those early arcs, but the fights don't get as exciting as later on. But Gachiakuta is different. Gachiakuta focuses heavily on world building, but does so in very small installments. You'll learn about one thing in one chapter, then something else another chapter, and it does this in very small doses. So as you start Gachiakuta, you only get glimpses of the world. You don't get a complete bird's eye view of the world. And it actually works out better because you get just enough to see how this world is unique, but not so much that you feel like it's completely explained. And because of this, you're always left wanting to know more so that you can piece everything together. Like, why are there two worlds? How did this happen? Why are there these weird powers? Who are the cleaners? Who are the vandals? What are they all after? What does this have to do with Rudo? So on the one hand, Gachiakuta takes longer to develop its world, but on the other hand, it's a more engaging experience where you feel like you're slowly learning about the world at your own pace, rather than having it dumped on you. Another thing I have to talk about is how Gachiakuta handles its themes and characterization. So one thing that blew me away about Soul Eater was the madness. Because the madness was what made people evil, but it was also like this force force of nature that everyone was susceptible to, and it was more a source of anxiety and oppression than evil. So it was this nuanced approach, and it was never laid out in black and white, and Okubo kind of carries that same approach into Fire Force as well. So when I came back to Gachiakuta, I was blown away by the fact that it kind of had its own madness, or rather, it talks about anxiety and trauma in this nuanced sort of way, without being preachy and without spelling it out in black and white. Again, I won't get into spoiler territory, but one of the main ways it does this is by comparing people to objects and examining the value we give to things and what it means to throw something away. And this might seem simple at first until you meet the character Amo. Amo has a lot of trauma and she's a deep character, but Urana doesn't just explain everything about her character. She gives you context clues and lets the reader reach certain conclusions on their own. In this sense, Gachiakuta is a lot like its predecessors from Okubo, but it's also one of the most mature stories out of the ongoing Shonen battle series. And I never thought I'd be saying this a year ago, but I'm pleasantly surprised. Another surprise was just how good the art is in this manga. Granted, when I started the manga before, I already liked the art, but having read Soul Eater and Fire Force, I gained a new appreciation for it. Because Okubo has a dynamic art style that ranges from simple chibi faces to wacky graffiti-like drawings. And Gachiakuta does the same thing. It has a lot of goofy reaction faces, but it's got a lot more crazy looking panels and a lot of graffiti art like Fire Force and Soul Eater. But one thing that Gachiakuta actually does better than Fire Force is consistency. Because Fire Force is gorgeous, but it's pretty tame artistically when you compare it to what Soul Eater looks like. In a sense, it almost seems toned down by comparison. Meanwhile, Gachiakuta always looks crazy. It's always full of detail, and it's just one of those manga where you're just like, how does Urana have the time to draw a manga this detailed every week? It's also got a lot of things going for it. Character designs, obviously, cool fight scenes, good paneling. It's easily one of the best looking manga that's out right now. A lot of it is because of what it borrows from Okubo's works, but a lot of it is because Urana is an extremely talented artist and has an art style that feels familiar yet entirely brand new all at the same time. And that's kind of why I'm in love with Gachiakuta. Gachiakuta is a unique manga that takes its time telling the story it wants to tell without spelling everything out for you. It is in every way the spiritual successor of Fire Force, but in so many other ways something brand new. It clearly has big plans, and I strongly suspect this story will continue to blow away expectations over the course of at least 300 chapters. And that is why it will definitely be the next big thing. But now I'd like to hear what you think. What was your first impression of Gachiakuta? How does it compare to other ongoing manga? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my video on Fire Force. In that video, I share my thoughts on Fire Force's anime and manga. You can find that video and the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.